Alexander asks, have you found the Ordo Salutis in the Latin fathers before Augustine, like Tertullian, Cyprian, Hilary, Ambrose of Milan, different from Augustine himself? What I'll say, Alexander, and I'll say this with regard to the doctrine of original sin, which is what I wrote on in my doctoral dissertation, you do see hints, a scent, a whiff, if you will, of some sub-doctrines of original sin in the early church fathers. You get some clear as day about corruption of human nature, mortality, propensity to sin. Those are clear. But on the things that Augustine affirms, like the inheritance, the mass damnation, the inheritance of the very guilt of Adam for all people, the sense of inability, what Augustine does, he almost serves as a compiler of the views of certain others, like Ambrosiaster or Ambrose and Cyprian. He draws from those three particularly. He quotes from them a lot, especially Ambrose and Cyprian. So he'll take their views and compile them to create a mega doctrine. I think historically that's what happens. And I am not alone in this. This is not a novel proposal. There are ample historical theologians who make this claim. Tatha Wiley, Justo Gonzalez, those are some big names in historical theology. So this should not be controversial as a matter of historical inquiry. So that's who he draws from. Jonathan Taze, I think, is another, which is also the name of a hockey player, but it's a historical theologian who's also written on original sin. Jonathan Taze was a Chicago Blackhawks hockey player. Your second question is, what about the Latin contemporaries of Augustine, like Jerome and Damascus of Rome? I have not read Damascus of Rome. What's interesting about Jerome that I like to point out is that he was the first to write against the Pelagians. It's not as if Augustine's response to the Pelagians is the only one out there. Further work should be done in looking at Jerome's theology, because you can hold to a non-Augustinian theological doctrine of anthropology and divine grace and reject Pelagianism. What's so common, it's ironic, is you get the false dichotomy, as I did. You're either a Calvinist or you're an Arminian. In the same way, there's this false dichotomy in the 5th century world. You're either an Augustinian or you're a Pelagian. And I smile because this is explicitly the case. When you read Prosper of Aquitaine, he basically makes this same thing. You're either an Augustinian or you're Pelagian. And it's only in Prosper's later career, he later travels to Rome and spends years there, that he softens his tone on this stuff. It's like he realizes, oh, wait a second, you don't have to be an Augustinian to be anti-Pelagian. So it's fascinating to see the false dichotomy on Calvinism and Arminianism, both of whom owe their tradition to the later Augustine, but you also get this false dichotomy between Augustinianism and Pelagianism. Fascinating stuff. I think we've got Andrew here again. He writes, I do see a lot of these things that are problematic in classical theism and how it's influenced by Greek philosophy. Andrew, I'm not a philosopher. I studied philosophy as an undergrad, but let me comment on this. I know that there's a tendency from open theists and others, and this is not a recent thing. I saw this in Greg Boyd maybe a decade ago, who talks about the influence of Greek philosophy on the church fathers and the church tradition, and I don't have interest in trying to prove that causal connection. I would rather stick with interpreting the biblical text and showing that Orthodox Christians believed in different models of anthropology and grace that are non-Augustinian, or later Augustinian, I would say, that they are not later Augustinian. That's what's of interest to me, because I think it's very difficult to prove a causal connection between some outside group there has some writings and you can see those concepts in so-and-so's writing. That doesn't mean there's a causal influence. So we want to be careful to not create a stronger burden than needed in these discussions. So that would be my advice on that. And I know that there are a lot of people who are going to make those accusations against Augustine. I just don't think we need to do that. Randy says, I'd love to read your dissertation. That's a huge research interest of mine. It was a huge research interest of mine too. Spent 5.5 years or so of my life working on it. So yeah, just connect with me, Randy. All right, last one here. Last comment I'll take from Pilgrim77 on YouTube. Do you think that the good that fallen man is capable of doing is due to the goodness of God's image that remains in fallen man? If so, is it grace or God's image make makes good possible from unsaved persons. Think about the way you phrase this question. Very good question, by the way, but think about the way there's an assumption that you've made in that question that the imago Dei is somehow devoid of divine grace. This is the same error that people who accuse the Gallic monks of semi-Pelagianism make, and it's really the same issue as the people who even think there is such thing as semi-Pelagianism. There are no semi-Pelagians in the 5th century, and I'll wait for anybody who's going to prove to me that there are. And I'll be happy to have that conversation. So semi-Pelagianism is a made-up ism, and I am fully prepared to defend that position. People say, well, it's useful. Yeah, but it's still made up. Nobody actually affirmed it in the 5th century. To your question, Pilgrim 77, you ask here, is there like grace that's added beyond the imago Dei? But the imago Dei is God's grace working. I don't think we need to pit those two against each other. We can say that the imago Dei is God's grace working, and depending upon how you want to ground the existence of free will, it's possible you don't want to, somehow you might not ground it in the imago Dei. I would, but you might not put it that way. What I would say is that the imago Dei has free will, and that is the grace of God working.